A new way to help the mentally ill in Wichita is hitting the streets this week, plus dozens of complaints of priests sexually abusing parishioners in 33 counties. Now, the KBI is investigating. And she's in. Susan Wagle says she's ready for a promotion. Are you ready to give it to her? That's what we're talking about right now on Kansas Week. And I'm your host, Pilar Pedraza. Now, just this Friday, the Chief Justice of the Kansas Supreme Court announced that he is retiring. Chief Justice Lawton Nuss has been in charge of the court since 2010. He's been on the Supreme Court bench since 2002, appointed by then Governor Republican Bill Graves. He has ruled the court through a number of controversial cases, including, of course, most famously, the school funding lawsuit that has gone through the court several times over the last 10 years or so. He's also well known for lobbying for pay raises for members of the judicial branch, saying that it is vital to keep that branch operating effectively. He is the second justice on the state Supreme Court to announce his retirement, following Lee Johnson, who is already on his way out at this point. So joining me today to discuss this topic and others, we have Adam Strunk, managing editor at the Newton Now, and State Representative Susan Humphreys, Republican from Wichita, and Wichita City Councilman and Vice Chair of the Democratic Party, Brandon Johnson. Thank you all so much. All right, I'm going to start with you, Susan, because you're on the state House here.
Yep.
This is something that does kind of impinge a little bit on state government, because the governor is going to now have her second choice of putting somebody on the state Supreme Court. That's going to really kind of affect how the court is balanced.
Absolutely, and yes, that's all. You know, and the timing of the retirement. I'm sure they just are ready to retire. Yeah. I don't know what the situation was there at all, but yeah. So there is some movement in the Senate to possibly address how the justices are appointed. Of course, it's not going to affect these two. This is going to be a long-term thing. But there is some interest in changing how we do that.
Yeah, because you were talking about the commission that chooses the next Supreme Court justices.
Yes.
It's kind of a mix of lawyers and governor appointees.
Exactly.
What would this change be to how that is done?
So right now we have the Missouri plan, is what it's called. There's a 9-member commission. They look at applications, and hopefully we'll have a lot of great applicants. They choose 3, and they give the governor 3 choices, and the governor will choose who he or she would appoint. In this case, she. That's in our Constitution. There is a movement. There is even a bill been introduced in the Senate that we would add one more level to that the Senate would need to confirm. Okay. We had some things happen this year with appointees for the appellate court, and so I think there is a bit of a movement to maybe add that one extra step, but it would be a constitutional amendment.
All right, very interesting. And of course, a constitutional amendment means that the public has to vote on that.
Absolutely.
Brandon, Vice Chair of the Democratic Party, this has got to be good news for the Democrats in Kansas. Gives them, as I've heard some jokes going around, a little bit more power in the state now.
Yeah, definitely. But I think overall it's just good for Kansas. I mean, we've got a new governor. She's doing a great job. And this is an opportunity for that commission to find some new and qualified folks to join the Supreme Court and, bring some new views.
Well, and I know that the state Supreme Court has been kind of controversial. There was in the last election that effort to unseat a lot of them because they didn't like some of the rulings that the Supreme Court was making on the death penalty. Is this, as you look at your readers, Adam, is this something that you think will play for them? Do they care?
I won't just say my readers, I'd say all readers. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure there are some people who are really into it and like, oh, okay, we have a justice, da-da-da-da-da, but I mean, there are so many political issues to follow right now that I don't know if that is, people are going out to the polls because they're concerned to get a constitutional amendment for how judges are appointed. Maybe that's not quite where we're at yet. So we'll see.
Good point.
Yeah. All right. Well, that of course happening just on Friday, but earlier this week, some really big news when it comes to the Kansas Senate race. State Senate President Susan Wagle announced this week she wants to be your next U.S. Senator, replacing retiring Senator Pat Roberts. She kicked off her campaign with a digital rollout on Wednesday. Here's a look at what to expect from her campaign that I filed with Cake News.
And after months of praying for guidance, I've decided to announce that I'm officially a candidate to represent Kansas in the United States Senate.
Kansas State Senate President Susan Wagle announced Wednesday morning she wants a new job, representing the entire state in the U.S. Senate. But making the decision to run was just the first of several hurdles political analysts say she'll face.
The biggest hurdle is, of course, Chris Kobach.
And almost every word of the announcement points to what analysts say will be a likely campaign theme, the anti-Kobach conservative.
I was appalled at how government contracts were being handed out without any oversight or transparency. That's just plain wrong.
Her own words casting her as a true conservative on government accountability and social issues, and tying her name to President Trump's.
And I'm fighting every day to make sure he has an ally for the Trump agenda right here in Kansas.
All while trying to separate herself from Chris Kobach, the presumed frontrunner in this race.
She's going to really try to find little ways, I suspect, to insist that she's on the hard right, but she's not on the hard right in the way that somebody like Kobach was, or that, say, somebody like Brownback was. I don't know how well she'll be able to thread that.
Kobach, a name known not just throughout Kansas, but throughout the country. Wagle, as a state senator, isn't quite as well known to Kansans and to some potential and vital campaign donors, especially since she's not following the path to the U.S. Senate tradition has set in Kansas over the last 30 years or so. First the U.S. House, then the Senate.
So it will be interesting to see how she tries to make up for that lack of name recognition. Now, let's not overemphasize this.
As a first woman elected president of the Kansas Senate, Wagle's made plenty of headlines over the years. Folks showing up to vote in the Wichita city primary knew who she was.
I just know her name and what she did here for Wichita. I can't list out detailed things. But I haven't really heard a lot of negativity about her.
Wichita voters we spoke to Wednesday were still split on what to think. Some told us they prefer Wagle over Kobach,
I'm hoping Susan Wagle. I just want her. I don't want Chris Kobach.
while others said it's too early to decide.
And I'd want to see who all got on the ballot, who all was willing to put themselves out there.
And of course, Susan Wagle, not a surprise that she was getting into the race. As a journalist who's covered her for years, sudden availability to the media was very telling. We knew as soon as this last session started that she was putting herself out there for something. As we look at this, though, name recognition being one of the biggest issues. She is not a statewide politician. I'm going to come to you, Adam. Is Susan Wagle a name that carries any recognition and power in Harvey County?
Well, or the state. Anytime this comes out, we talk about name recognition, but Laura Kelly wasn't really a recognized name either. People who followed politics knew Laura Kelly, but I think that this Wagle deal, for the Republican Party, to me, this is try not to lose this race like they lost the governor's spot. And they are in this tough position to where they have to have someone who can come out to win the primary. And to win the primary, you have to be way, 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 way over here. But you have to have someone who seems stable enough that you don't slough all the moderate Republicans if the Democrats put forward a decent candidate, which is what we saw in the governor's election. So I don't know if name recognition is a big deal. Kobach has a lot of name recognition. That didn't help him in the governor's race.
And in fact, some say
it
that hurt him. So as we look at this, of course, a lot of talk about, depending on who the winner is in the primary, that we could be looking at a very competitive general election as well. How does Susan Wagle, Brandon, stack up against potential Democrat candidates?
You know, when we look at this last session, I think Democrats have a great chance with Susan Wagle. Susan was really an obstructionist to what Governor Kelly wanted to do. Oftentimes, instead of having conversations and looking at ways to compromise and go forward, she was just a no vote. And I think that's going to hurt over time. You know, we don't want someone representing Kansas in the U.S. Senate that's just always going to stop progress. We'd like to see someone who can work together, reach across the aisle, and make a best solution for the state. And we saw oftentimes this year that just did not happen.
Now, Susan, we're really seeing Susan
Yeah.
Wagle position herself as a master legislator in how she's trying to present herself to the state, as somebody who's worked with her to a certain extent in the State House. What's your impression on that?
Well, she's also my senator, just as a matter of interest. I think she'd be a fabulous senator. And I think she first was elected to the House, I want to say 92. She has the years, she's put it in. She's been she's worked with Republican governors, Democrat governors. She's gotten things done. She's shown that she's a leader. I don't think she's just an obstructionist. I think she works hard and she stands by conservative values, but she also sees both sides. I found her to be excellent and knowledgeable and helpful, actually, as I've kind of jumped into this legislative season of my life. So I think she's great.
Yeah, and she would be the first, presuming she won, she would be the first female to represent Kansas as a U.S. Senator.
Which would be a great added benefit. Yes.
All right, so it's going to be a long race. As I was speaking with some of her staff, they're like, it's going to be a long year, a year from August.
So, but on the same line, when you think about it, though it would be great if she won and she'd be a female representing, when you look at, as you said in the beginning of the segment, availability, constituents have reached out many times, and oftentimes they're unheard. And one of the things that I know I care about outside of all my other roles is accessibility to those who represent me. Senator Moran is always accessible, answers his phone, he reaches back out to you. You see that with Congressman Estes. But when we've seen so far, when you look at a track record, we haven't seen that same accessibility with President Wagle. And I would just hope, if she were to win, that would change. But that's something that's concerning to the citizens, I know, of Wichita.
Could I just add that our elected officials in Washington have all kinds of staff. And so that's a little bit different. I really feel like the senators have so many constituents, and I've found Susan to be responsive. But, I can't speak for all of the constituents. So
yeah,
she doesn't have the folks to help her.
What I did find interesting, and this is speaking from the journalistic perspective, is she did not make herself available to media on the day that she announced her run, and that was interesting. I was told that she was working with fundraisers, and certainly financing. You talked about name recognition not being everything. Financing is a big part, and that's why Laura Kelly won that race. So certainly a very important part of a U.S. Senate race.
Hey, at least she'll actually live in Kansas. Not have an armchair.
And she has some family things going on too. I just need to add that too.
Yes, that is true.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I do think attaching oneself to the Trump agenda is not going to bode well. I mean, that can go several different ways, and we've seen both Secretary Kobach and President Wagle kind of hugging that, and that also sends some worry through some people. How far are you going to go? Will you be a check? There's 3 branches of government, and so far there's not too many people who will check the executive branch. Will she be that? Those are questions that will have to be answered.
Well, and another question for voters, she is very closely tied to the Brownback administration and was one of his prime supporters. Does that help her or hurt her?
Depends. I mean, I'm guessing if people running in a general election, the strategy is going to just be repeat Brownback over and over. You probably won't say Wagle without Brownback in the same sentence, I'm guessing. But I mean, yeah, it sure hurt some of the other people who ran and got tied to Brownback. So I don't think Brownback is a label that helps anyone in the state anymore. But.
And I'd like to move on from that label too. But I know when I entered, not me personally, but I feel like that, let's what are we doing here and now? We can't always go back to the ghost of Brownback.
No, but we're still fixing the mess left by the ghost.
And I felt when I first entered the legislature, Susan was one of the most vocal to me, saying, watch out with what's going on with Brownback. You need to be careful. I mean, she was very much a pragmatist, and she saw what was going on, and she warned me about that.
Then again, talking to some of the other colleagues, like she beat some colleagues in line when they were trying to step out of line and to take a more moderate stance under that Brownback administration.
I wasn't there then, so
yeah.
Well. And I think I've heard that same narrative. In the beginning, definitely that pragmatist, working across the aisle, doing all of these things, but it just seemed as of the Brownback administration that there was just this further, if you step out of line of this agenda, you get checked. And I mean, we saw that in the paper. That's why I think we saw senators leave the party. I mean, it was interesting.
Well, this is a debate that's probably going to continue for
probably
the next year or so. So we're going to move on to our next story here, turning to crime. The Kansas Bureau of Investigations announced this week it's looking into 74 cases of sexual abuse by Catholic clergy here in Kansas. The Wichita Eagle reported this week that Kansas' top law enforcement agency has launched dozens of criminal investigations into Catholic leaders in 33 counties. The cases stem from a task force in February that asked the public to report all complaints of abuse by clergy, no matter how long ago. The KBI says it got 119 reports, 74 of those now part of ongoing criminal investigations. The Eagle reports at this time no charges have been filed and no arrests have been made. Only 2 of Kansas' 4 dioceses have followed the growing national trend of releasing lists of alleged child molesting priests, Salina and Kansas City. The Wichita and Dodge City dioceses have not. And this is a story that has been ongoing really for a couple of years now. As we look at this, I know there's a bill in the Senate that would make actually it started in the Senate, has passed the Senate, is in the House.
Right.
That would make clergy mandatory reporters.
Yes.
Does this increase the probability of that bill working its way through the House next year?
Well, you may know that bill, Senate Bill 218, passed 39-0 in the Senate. I don't think the probability is it's going to get to the House and it's going to pass overwhelmingly. I don't know that this would make a difference or not. It was going to pass anyway.
No.
So I think we're headed for that, for the clergy to be mandatory reporters, joining teachers and firefighters and other groups.
And certainly I've been hearing a lot of folks very upset with the Catholic Church. Are you hearing from readers at all?
I'm not. I mean, I'm sure there are plenty of people who are upset. It's not something I'm getting letters into right now, but this report just came out.
No. Yeah. And as we look at this ongoing issue, you know, looking at it from the higher level perspective, kind of the political public relations perspective, the fact that the Diocese of Wichita has not released the lists the way Salina and Kansas City have doesn't look good, even though the diocese says it is working with investigators.
Right. I mean, transparency is always a good thing, and I think that helps out if you do release it.
I mean, the truth isn't immoral. The truth isn't ever immoral. Hiding the truth, though, that's complicit in the same immorality as the action. The action's what's immoral. And I think that, I mean, I say that about journalists, I say that about police officers, I say that about clergy, I say that about anyone who has the public trust, but I don't understand why anyone protects people who betray that sort of trust. Like, it makes everyone as a group look bad.
And I don't know why they haven't reported it. I mean, I have no idea.
Yeah.
But I will say that the Catholic Church wholeheartedly supported Senate Bill 218.
Yes, they did.
And they even helped initiate some of the investigation. And so they're on board with what's going on to get things out in the open. I can't explain. I don't know what's going on. Maybe it's a timing issue with Wichita. I don't know.
And without them telling us, none of us knows.
Yeah, true.
So there is that. But certainly not the only crime issue we're dealing with in the Wichita area. The city of Wichita is getting some help, though, battling its violent crime problems. The city has nearly doubled the national rate of violent crime, and now that's getting some extra help from the Justice Department in a program called the National Public Safety Partnership. KSN's Craig Andrus explains.
Out on the streets, Wichita police say they've made some strides in shutting down violent crimes this year. Homicides and shootings down compared to last year at this time.
Wichita is making a good step, but it has to start with building relationships.
Pastor DeShazer's worked closely with police to see what can be done, and a key, he says, is community partners. Wichita police hope a new partnership with the feds will help.
It has shown results in other cities. And it is in many ways a privilege for Wichita to be selected.
The U.S. Attorney and Justice Departments will help by sending WPD, prosecutors, and sheriff's deputies to other cities. They will learn and collaborate to see what is working to stop violent crimes across the country.
Meth, mental health, they'll put us in contact with others who have dealt with some of the same things and how they've overcome them and addressed them.
For community leaders like DeShazer, they hope bringing in expertise from the ATF, U.S. Marshals, and the DEA will be one part of the solution to slow violent crime.
When you bring in all these agencies and the entire community, I believe we're making a good step forward.
And I know, Brandon, you're on the city council, so I'm going to come to you first on this. How big of a deal is this?
It's a really big deal. You know, we've been talking about violent crime for a while, definitely since I've been in office, since last year. And this collaboration and help is always a good thing. It gives us new things to think about. And when you look at the issues that we're having, especially with mental health being a part of that and the use of methamphetamines, we could get all the help that we could use all the help we can get. So definitely a big deal.
Talking about that drug problem, it's something that I've heard Chief Ramsey talk about, I've heard Sheriff Easter talk about, you've heard about it talked about quite a bit in Harvey County.
Yeah. I mean, it's something that's pervasive across Kansas, and it's so cheap, and it's so addictive, and it's so problematic. And so, yeah, you do have with methamphetamine, you have violent crime taking huge jumps, you have property crime taking huge jumps, and yeah, it's a really hard issue to address, but that's the drug issue that should be addressed.
Yeah.
Like, that's the time we should spend on a drug issue, is methamphetamine.
Is this something that's coming up at the State House, Susan?
I would say what's more coming up in the State House has to do with that mental health piece, that we really need to help take care of that we've been lacking, and that's we talk about that quite often. So helping with the mental health, I think the 30% of the inmates, it's a mental health issue, and we see it over and over. So I love these creative solutions, like see what other places are doing. Let's get out of the box and try to see what's helping other places.
And talk about see what's happening in other places. When they made the announcement, Milwaukee, huge drop in the murder rate, and New Orleans had something like a half drop in its violent crime rate once it started participating in this program. So some very encouraging numbers as we look at what happened in other cities.
Good.
Yeah, definitely looking forward to it. There is some citizen concern about unintended consequences of having all of these agencies here, but you know, I think that's something that we're all looking at to make sure that it's not anything negative that happens in our city.
Yeah, certainly anytime you make changes, there's always the concern for unintended consequences.
Yes.
So as we move forward, any ideas where this might be going yet? What conversations have been held as far as what's in store?
You know, I'm actually talking to the chief next week about that. So at this point, I haven't talked to him directly, but a lot of what I've heard is just looking for what are those best practices that will come from this collaboration, and then how can we implement it here? And I know the chief is looking at what can we do right now. So if there's some best practices that can be implemented this year, he wants to do that.
Okay, and I'm going to open this up to anybody who wants to answer, but what is there, if anything, that Wichitans on the street can do to help with the situation while we're trying to deal with it at the city and police level?
You know, the thing that I've been talking about in all of our violence meetings, outside of getting to know your neighbors, is to truly talk to people. You know, if you're having a friend or someone, one of your neighbors that maybe is going through some tough times, and you know that, and then they start to act erratically, you know something's up. You know, either there's a mental health issue or maybe they've turned to drugs to soothe whatever pain they're having. You can really work through that, and you can be a better help to law enforcement, because you can say, hey, look, I know this person, this traumatic thing just happened, and then, you know, maybe we bring in that other team we have, and we start looking at what are some other ways we can help you rather than just enforcement.
Okay, you brought up the other team, so we're going to move on to that real quick.
Not to jump ahead.
That's all right. It was probably about time. A big part of what police officers deal with, as Brandon mentioned, has its root in mental health problems. Now, officers will have some backup in dealing with those issues. We go back to KSN's Craig Andrus for the details.
Right now, WPD officers do get training to respond to mental health calls. But soon more will be on the way with an entire team.
Some people need help immediately, particularly if somebody's really acting out and they're worried about their own safety or the safety of a loved one.
Today, officials announced that a paramedic, an officer, and a CommCare worker will respond in a new fire department vehicle.
This truly is what collaboration looks like.
Starting next week, when a beat officer identifies a mental health call or there is a 911 call for mental health, the team will be on the way.
Because is jail really the answer? Probably not.
Sedgwick County Sheriff Jeff Easter says at any time the jail is filled with 30% mental health patients. Many of those, he says, have been in and out of jail.
And we have one case study where last year there was an individual over about a month and a half time frame was booked into the county jail 17 times that has a mental health issue.
So they hope the team can help patients avoid jail or an escalating scene. The hope is also to get help with a crisis team right up front when there is a mental health emergency declared.
That's one of the perks of doing this program. Get there early, get them help, get them connected to necessary services that they may not know about.
And Brandon, I'm going to pick up where we left off here talking about this issue. Certainly something that the chief and the sheriff have been working on for a long time. Do you know where this idea came from or how it was developed?
So where it came from, though, I do know that Councilmember Fry and Councilmember, now Commissioner Pete Meitzner, have been working on that for a couple of years with the county and just trying to find a way to address the issues that we were having. You get so many of those calls with law enforcement. We continue to have more demands on law enforcement to do different things that they traditionally hadn't had to do. So this is one of those teams that can identify, hey, we're having a mental health issue, rather than bring more law enforcement. How can we get that support around to deal with that issue? Because we have seen some people with mental health issues have lethal force used on them just because of what's going on. So
Not that long ago.
This might be an opportunity to reduce those incidents with this team.
I imagine, I mean, it's a pilot program right now, so not specialized people put into it yet as far as that's their paying job. There'll be regular paramedics, et cetera, that are pulled off to work on this team. But I'd imagine that this is a program that other cities and counties are going to be watching.
Well, yeah, and I think it's a great idea, but other counties have been implementing programs similar to this. We have and you're talking about getting training. Crisis intervention training is something that we've had sheriff's officers and police officers up in Newton working with. We have mental health facilities up there, such as Prairie View. And it's basically training to train officers on how to identify someone having a mental crisis instead of maybe the person isn't resisting, maybe the person is talking to themselves, maybe the person is just identifying all of those signs. And the whole idea is, one, to decrease possible lethal force or harm for those people in need, but two, to also decrease injuries maybe to the officer or to the people around. And so I think those are programs that need to be applauded.
Absolutely. Doesn't have much to do with state government. But I love the looking outside and doing things differently and trying different things, and hopefully we'll have great success and they'll be able to implement it.
Well, and maybe more mental health care beds mean there's more of a buffer between police officers
and that does have to do
people
with
in need of services.
Absolutely.
Jumping into my next question there. Big surprise, journalists kind of think alike a little bit. But, you know, how effective can something like this be with the current lack of long-term mental health services available in the state?
It's what I've mentioned this before, it's on our minds often. And it's juggling funds and what goes where and how to figure out the best use of the funds of the state. But I think there's pretty much agreement that our mental health, we need more long-term beds, crisis care, you know, there's a lot of holes in the system that we need to work on.
Brandon?
I think from the state level, in some of my years talking to legislators, representatives, and senators, you know, data was always one of those things that kind of drove some votes. And with these new teams, we may be able to see, you know, if we had X amount of beds, then we can have this reduction in cost in another area. And as that data comes in, maybe we can see some increased funding specifically for certain things.
Great point.
And certainly, perhaps maybe convincing the state to help pay for this program, considering there is right now no permanent funding.
That's always great.
Well, as always, we are running out of time. Adam, Susan, Brandon, thank you so much for joining us this week. I appreciate it. And thank you as well. We'd like to thank our news partners at KSN News, Cake News, and the Wichita Eagle for sharing their materials with us. I hope you've enjoyed our discussion. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's topics or future ideas for shows. Just email us at kansasweek@kpts.org. For now, have a great week.